Alireza Firouzja has had an exceptional 2021, and I've been looking back at some of his best games of the year. In this game he shows that he's not just a tactical magician, but he also has incredible positional prowess for someone so young. It was played against Evgeny Najer in the Grand Swiss event earlier this year, so a seasoned Russian GM and not an easy opponent. So these were the opening moves here. Firouzja had white, and we went in for this Petrov line. Once again we saw the modern attack here, and Firouzja plays this sideline of taking on e5. More common is bringing the bishop out to d3 immediately. We now had pawn to d5 here, knight b to d2, and black captures on d2 now. The most common way to play, not allowing white to capture on e4, which we saw in a recent game against Abasov, where Firouzja crushed him in 28 moves, I think it was. Firouzja recaptures with the bishop. We now had bishop to e7 here, pawn to c3 from Firouzja, so he takes the time out to take control of this d4 square, which we'll see is a key battleground in this game. Now we had pawn to c5, bishop comes to d3 developing, and knight to c6 now from Najer. So this is a fairly standard opening position in these lines. White has this established pawn on e5, which is cramping black, but black has the threat of later going d4 and gaining space in that line. So it's a double-edged position. We now had castles from Firouzja, and now I think Najer plays the wrong positional plan here. So he plays bishop to g4. He's pressuring this knight, and so looking to gain extra control over these squares by eliminating it potentially in the future. But the problem is that this bishop often sits very well on e6 as a defender of these key squares. And what we'll see in the game is that by bringing the bishop to g4, it takes a lot of time here for black, and the queen ends up having to sit as a blockader on e6, where it's slightly misplaced. So Firouzja goes rook to e1, natural development, queen to d7 here, pawn to h3, now kicking that bishop. It now drops back to h5. You don't necessarily want to give up the bishop pair just yet, because you're not actually winning a pawn in the process. Bishop to f4 now from Firouzja, more over protection of this pawn and improving this bishop. And we had queen to e6 now. So this is where that queen is now sitting slightly uncomfortably there. We had bishop to e2 now from Firouzja, so it's a really nice time out just to break the pin here. Just going back a move, he wants to play queen to d2 here, so he can then bring the rook to the d file, but the problem then is you're running into these doubled pawns. So that's why he takes the time to first go bishop to e2, then after we have castles from black, now queen to d2, bishop g6 now from Najer, and rook a to d1. So this is the problem for black. This bishop's gone g4, h5, g6. In the meantime, Firouzja's taken the time to bring both rooks to the centre of the board here. His bishops are sitting prettier, and these rooks are yet to get into the game. So bishop to e4 now from Najer. He centralises that piece, but we had knight to g5 in response. So these two are forked, and that's why black has to give up the bishop pair here. We had the recapture from Firouzja, and now pawn to d4. Good move, striking in the centre and claiming some space of his own. It should be noted, just going back a move, that you don't want to take this pawn here as black. Say you take with the knight, the problem is you're running into this f3 move, and after the bishop moves away, there are various ways in which white can play, but the point is this d5 pawn is dropping with the queen. Say f4 here, for example, kicking the knight away, the bishop's coming to f3, and you're just ripping open the board for both of the white rooks and the bishops. And if the queen takes, it's a very similar story. f3, bishop drops away, maybe bishop c4, lots of good moves here, and the board is being blown open in a bad way for black. So that's why Najer goes pawn to d4 instead. And now we had bishop to f1 from Firouzja. He tucks this bishop away and now opens up the e-file for his rook. So that's why we had queen g6 defending this unprotected piece. Queen to f4 now from Firouzja. He hits that piece for a second time. And bishop c2 now. The rook jumps up to d2 attacking that piece. And we had the rook sliding across to the e-file now. Note that Najer goes with the a rook here rather than the f rook. He'd like to perhaps put the f rook on e8 and then the a rook on d8, but this bishop is blocking that plan, so that's why he goes with the other rook, and he's potentially preparing an f pawn break in the future, but he struggles with his plans here, as we'll see. So Firouzja now plays bishop to h4, another really nice positional move. He's just getting out of the way of any tactics from f6. He's also allowing his queen to move freely in future without this bishop being a tactical liability from the black queen. And we'll see that this bishop is now re-manoeuvring itself as well. So king to h8 from Najer, preparing f6 potentially. Pawn to f3 now, and we can see what this does. It opens up this line for the dark squared bishop, and this pawn is going to be in trouble if Najer's not careful. The problem here for black is that you don't want to now capture on c3, because after the pawn recaptures, you're opening this d line for the rook in a really deadly fashion. So after Firouzja plays pawn to f3, we had pawn to a6, preparing b5 in the future, but it's all a bit slow and the plans are a bit mixed up. If he had tried f6 immediately, the problem here is you just take as white, and let's say these rooks get swapped off, you recapture here, and then after the rook takes back like this, you can bring the queen into c7, and there's back rank problems here as we can see. This b7 pawn is weak, and it's just a very loose position now for black. So that's why Najer didn't go for this, and he instead tried pawn to a6, but this runs into problems of a different kind, because Firouzja slides the bishop back to f2, pressuring here. We had rook to d8 defending, and now after rook to c1 picking up a tempo on this bishop, bishop to b1, we had takes on d4, and now the knight recaptured, bishop takes, so Firouzja's given up the bishop pair here, but in compensation for that, he's won a pawn. He first takes the time out to go a3 and protects this one, because he can pick this pawn up at his leisure, and now black goes bishop to a2. Najer wants to free up the queen for activity here, but he first had to take care of this bishop, which would have been on prise otherwise. So now Firouzja chops the pawn, and we had queen to b6, pinning this rook to the king here, but Firouzja's got it all worked out. So after rook c to d1, doubling on the file here, black doesn't have time to take on b2, or now we chop these rooks here and we're winning a piece. So coming back here, that's why Najer played rook across to the e file, and now Firouzja goes king h2 to break that pin. We had this simplification now on d4, there wasn't much better for black. The queen recaptured, the queens came off here, and we went in for this endgame position. So black first played pawn to g5 to give the king some luft and not run into a back rank checkmate. Now we had rook to d7, pawn to b5, and rook to d6 now. So Firouzja prefers to swap his e5 pawn for this a6 pawn, because this one is then weak and he's looking to generate an outside pass pawn on the queen side. We had bishop to c4 now. These bishops got exchanged, and now pawn to a4 from Firouzja. So rook to c5 from Najer, logical. Rook to b6 now, pawn to c3, pawn captures, rook takes, and pawn to a5, past pawns need to be pushed. King to g7, pawn to a6, rook to a3 coming behind the pawn. So Najer has now set up a powerful defensive position coming behind that passed pawn, and it's going to be difficult for Firouzja to make progress. We had king to g3, rook to a2, and now's an interesting moment. Firouzja could have waited with rook to c6, and then black basically has to wait as well with a move like pawn to h6. If you bring the rook to a3, then the king can step up and you can go g3 and maybe start making some progress. But instead of this, Firouzja immediately goes pawn to f4. Arguably he would have had to try for this break anyway. The pawn takes, the king takes, but with this way of playing we note that this pawn is now being given up on g2. So the rook captures here, and Firouzja now marches the king in. So this is his big idea, that he can march the king into the position, but as we can see, black gets this f-pawn going, which is absolutely the correct thing to do. And with best play, this position is actually a draw now with the 2-on-2. So Firouzja goes pawn to a7, we had pawn to f2, and now he has to drop back to b1 to stop this queening. But in this position, Najer makes really quite an inexplicable blunder. He goes pawn to f1 queen, allowing Firouzja to take, and now there's just no way to stop the promotion of this pawn once Firouzja builds a bridge with his rook. What he should have done here is just play a waiting move like king to f6, and now if Firouzja goes rook to f1, you can bring the king to g5 here, and there's no possibility to actually deflect the black rook away here, because the problem is if you take here, after the rook recaptures, it might look like you're queening now, but black has this important check on f8, But Najer didn't play king f6 here, he instead queened, Firouzja took, and now we had rook to b2 check. But the king just hides on a8 now, and the problem is white builds a bridge with his rook. So rook to c1, king to g6, rook to c7, pawn to h5, and now rook to b7. Real themes of the Lucena position here. The rook has to give ground, the rook comes to b6 check, king g5, king b7, and now rook a3, getting behind the pawn, but rook a6 prepares to queen it. Rook b3 now check, king c7, and here Najer threw in the towel, because if you keep checking, the king is just going to march up the board, and there's nothing you can do then to stop the promotion of this pawn. So a beautiful positional crush from Firouzja. If you've enjoyed this video and never want to miss another, then click here to subscribe, and see Firouzja's round 1 game against Abbasov, click here. Thanks very much for watching, and see you soon.